Minister Perrottet has joined us today to speak on what I think is perhaps the most timely topic that we could have selected for this particular event. The heading is The Great Divorce, the costly divide between economic and social policy. The most obvious example of the end result of that divide is being played out as we speak in the European Union and particularly in Greece. The disconnection in people's minds between the cost of social policy and the potential impacts on the economy are quite large. Governments around the world are facing a perfect storm of rising entitlements, bloated bureaucracies and ageing populations. But we seem to be stymied in the process of fundamental reforms, and the focus has been shifted to ways to raise more revenue. But what will we do when the money runs out? Will we continue borrowing until we end up in a situation similar to Greece? Will we instead embrace reform as we did in the 80s, facing the crises we had there? Well, we are going to invite our speaker to answer that question for us. Mr Perrottet is the member for Hawkesbury in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. He previously served as the member for Castle Hill from 2011. He was appointed the Minister for Finance and Services, and I do note that we have a previous Minister for Finance in the audience, so we may be able to get some insights there. In April 2015, this portfolio was expanded to include property and innovation, two of the most important things that the government could be looking at this time. Mr Perrottet grew up in the Hills District, was educated at Redfield College and Oak Hill College before graduating from Sydney University with a commerce and a law degree, and I can personally testify exactly how valuable those degrees are. Before entering Parliament, Mr Perrottet worked as a solicitor at HDY in the area of banking restructure and insolvency law, but I rather hope that we don't come down to needing an insolvency practitioner. I would like to invite the Minister to come and speak to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And can I say, to echo those words, that whilst we sit here in St Leonard's, really the eyes of the world today are on Greece and the financial turmoil that Greece is going through. But it comes as no surprise to me that Greece is currently experiencing such a tough time. And a recent story I heard strikes that chord, and it is about their finance minister. And writing on his blog, Yanis Varoufakis related his life experience and how his life has unfolded. After living and working in the UK for some time, he said he could no longer bear to live there after Margaret Thatcher won her third term. He said, "Soon I started planning my escape. The question was, where do I escape to?" Well, luckily, Australia stepped up and he managed to get a position at the great University of Sydney teaching economics, a position he occupied for 12 years. Unfortunately for him, though, the lucky country here in Australia turned out to be not so lucky, for him anyway. That period of time also coincided with the success of another famous Conservative, John Howard. A golden age for Australia, but for Mr Varoufakis, it was a painful and difficult time where he had to endure an apparent Conservative turn under that awful little man, John Howard. So once again he pulled up stakes and left again, this time returning to his native Greece. Not much chance of finding an economic liberal there, I suppose, where he is now finance minister in the ruling left-wing Syriza party. As Piers Ackerman said, the man responsible for turning around the failing Greek economy has bolted from two nations because they were led by two competent leaders who managed to prevent them going down the path of bankruptcy. Ominous signs for Greece indeed. This anecdote, while amusing, has a serious side. For some in the political class, mainly on the left, a fundamental denial of economic reality is taking place. As I've said before, no one has ever run up a tab that they didn't have to pay. And for Greece, payment is now due. Greece faces many problems: a large welfare state, extensive government borrowings, cronyism and corruption, generous public pensions with low retirement ages, lax fiscal discipline compounded by a failure to collect taxes. These are not liquidity problems, but solvency problems. What is missing from Greece and other EU countries has been political will or the ability to implement meaningful structural reform. So what does this mean for us here in Australia? Well, as Tom Palmer from the CIS wrote recently, the distance from Athens to Canberra is pretty far, but they're getting closer every day. We see this story playing out on a smaller scale at a federal level, with significant and lasting implications for the states. Just last week, the Baird government delivered a record budget in New South Wales, a solid surplus and major investments. It is investing in productive assets like infrastructure that creates jobs, that builds the economy and will provide returns well into the future. This was a budget built on fiscal discipline, targeted spending and smart use of capital. But this was also a budget delivered in the shadow of reduced federal funding in key areas like health and education. There is little doubt that this is a significant challenge that will place all state budgets under renewed pressures in the years to come. As the Minister for Finance and Services and Property in New South Wales, I live in a world of facts and figures, charts and tables, projections and estimates. These numbers do not lie, but they tell me one thing. Our current patterns of economic behaviour here in the West are unsustainable. And just like we're seeing in Greece, you can kick the can down the road for some time, but eventually you'll run out of road. A fundamental part of the problem is that our social policy is completely divorced from our economic policy. They are considered in isolation, and as I experienced in government, they are developed like government in silos. This divide has created unsustainable, largely structural deficits that can only be financed by levying unreasonable taxes on future generations. In reality, economics is downstream from culture. Our policies on welfare, families and cultural issues all have economic implications. Too often, our political debate is couched in the terms of how the government can raise even more taxes, take even more of your money to meet its seemingly insatiable appetite for new spending, all with a short-term focus. As a former Labor Finance Minister, Lindsay Tanner, has noted, much of the discussion focuses on meeting the needs of the 24-hour news cycle or a short electoral cycle, rather than addressing deeper underlying issues. Raising more taxes on high income earners, changing the rules so government gets more of your super, or increasing the fuel excise are all stopgap measures that sidestep the main problem. Governments are spending too much. And each year, our Tax Freedom Day, the day that we stop working to pay the government and start working to pay ourselves, moves even further down the calendar. We are spending too much on the wrong things for little result. And there are three ways in particular that I think that the government across the world are divorcing economic reality from social policy. And that's what I want to cover with you today. The first is by simply throwing money at social issues and measuring the success of these programs by the size of the investment rather than the end outcome. One of the clearest examples of this can be seen in the United States. In March of 1965, a little-known bureaucrat named Daniel Patrick Moynihan released a report into the widening gap between the black community and the rest of American society. The Moynihan report, as it became known, caused a firestorm of controversy. It was attacked by the left for describing a tangle of pathologies in low-income neighbourhoods, each factor feeding into the next to create a vicious cycle of poverty. It was attacked by the right for highlighting the pervasive racism that battered and harassed black communities for over 3 centuries. But Moynihan's most controversial finding, and one that is still being debated today, was proposing a link between family breakdown and government welfare. The steady expansion of welfare programs, wrote Moynihan, was directly tied to the steady disintegration of family structure. Moynihan was unequivocal in citing the collapse of the nuclear family as the primary reason for black inequality. And he was equally direct at laying the blame on government policies where, quote, marriage was penalised and single parenthood subsidised. In essence, the welfare state was acting as a substitute for the family, crowding out its formation and increasing rates of divorce. This was having a flow-on effect of ensnaring lower income families in a poverty trap from which few escape. But things were about to get worse. Instead of winding back these well-intentioned but damaging policies, the US government dialed them up, launching a massive war on poverty effort, focusing on food stamps, welfare payment, and misguided housing projects. In 1965, the year the Moynihan Report was released, 25% of black children lived in single-parent households. Today, that figure is over 70%. The war on poverty and other welfare programs essentially created a destructive feedback loop. Welfare promoted the decline of marriage, which in turn generated the need for even more welfare. To date, more than $22 trillion has been spent by US governments to end poverty over the past 50 years. The poverty rate, though, has remained pretty much the same as when the program began. No one can doubt the good intentions of those who sought to end inequality. The outcome, though, has been catastrophic. We see similar problems here in Australia. Take, for example, the recent documentary Struggle Street that follows the lives of those living in poorer neighbourhoods in Sydney's western suburbs. This was also controversial. It was attacked by some as publicly funded poverty porn, and it kicked off a debate about how we treat those at the margins of our society. I thought one of the most telling contributions to the debate came from Nick Cater, writing in The Australian, where he revealed that Mount Druitt was once the site of the largest housing project undertaken by the state of New South Wales. Today, 1 in 5 houses in that suburb, around 12,000, still belong to Housing New South Wales. More than half the tenants are single parents. They outnumber married parents, 3 to 1, and the vast majority living there receive some kind of social security payments. Once again, we see the same tangle of pathologies described by Moynihan: delinquency, dysfunction, crime and family breakdown, all with the same devastating effects. This well-intended but ham-fisted intervention to social policy by governments is having very real economic consequences. Of the nearly $450 billion in spending in the federal government, social security and welfare spending now makes up 35%. And don't kid yourself, this is not just a federal government problem. It affects the budget of every single household in Australia. For example, an individual on a salary of $50,000 pays around $8,000 in tax, $3,000, on almost 40%, goes into welfare. That's more than double health and 4 times the spending on education. The solution, though, is more nuanced than simply slashing spending. Slashing spending. Slashing spending can be seen as lazy economic policy just as much as raising taxes can be. New Zealand's Finance Minister, Bill English, gave an insightful speech very recently at the Menzies Research Centre in Melbourne on exactly this topic, who was critical of what he called the post-war model of simply borrowing and committing billions of dollars on good intentions. Instead, the focus has to be on purchasing results. And you do this by making highly customised social investments. By using data and analytics to understand their customers, the New Zealand government was able to work out what the path to welfare was, just who was going to fall into that trap, and what their lifetime cost was going to be. They then targeted training and support to the most vulnerable in the community in an effort to drive down those costs. In essence, reducing misery rather than simply servicing it. This approach would mean less welfare payments over time, fewer government programs, and a smaller number of bureaucrats needed to administer them. In other words, smaller government through better government. The second way that governments are failing to consider the economic reality of their social policy is by failing to invest in the future, the generations to come. Many financial analysts are now watching the events in Europe closely, convinced that a Greek exit from the euro is becoming a foregone conclusion. But the current debates around the Eurozone only serve to obscure one of the most important statistics that really should be getting a lot more attention. And it is not net debt or GDP, it's birth rates. At just 1.34 births per woman, Greece has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. As the number of deaths is now exceeding the number of births, it's much better being in the business of funerals than being in the business of baptisms. In just 30 years from now, it is expected that 1 in 3 Greeks will be aged over 65. You can't borrow against the future, writes Mark Stein, because in the crudest sense, you don't have one. Welcome to my big, fat Greek funeral. Greece isn't alone. Italy, Portugal and Spain also have below replacement birth rates, caught in what some have described as a demographic death spiral where recovery is almost impossible. Last week we learnt that Italy's birth rate has dropped to the lowest level since 1861, and soon enough 6 in 10 Italians will have no brothers, no sisters, no cousins, no aunties and no uncles. Germany, the so-called powerhouse of the EU, is expecting its population to shrink by almost 20% over the next 30 years. In fact, Europe's most rapidly growing family type is the one-person household. While the decline in birth rates is multi-causal, there is no doubt the meddling hand of big government is at work once again, with profound implications for the sustainability of human capital. Some have argued that social security replaces the role of children in old age by socialising the traditional duties of the family. I know Greg Lindsay has also written previously on the perverse incentives created by common pools of welfare, where everyone seeks to benefit at the expense of everyone else. Countries with large pension systems tend to struggle with fertility. As one commentator has said, why have children at all when the state will take care of you in your old age? An ageing population also poses significant economic challenges. How do you grow an economy in an ever-shrinking market? How do you access capital when so much is tied up in pensions and benefits? How do you start up businesses when entrepreneurs are mostly found among the young? Just like Greece and other parts of Europe, we here in Australia are seeing the same troubling shift in social patterns: a collapse in marriage, a decline in birth rates, and a rapidly ageing population. As Malcolm Turnbull noted in his maiden speech in 2004, 10 years ago, demography is indeed destiny. The demographic storm is coming. How hard it blows and how well our children weather it will depend in large measures on the decisions that we take today. But just like in parts of Europe, we're seeing governments that are focused on building up the needs of older generations at the expense of those who are yet to come. Some in the UK have described this where the smartest financial move that you can make is to grow old, where you'll be better off in retirement than you were when you were working. It's no wonder that the young, the millennials, are increasingly losing trust in government and are resentful of paying into a system that they may never benefit from. Edmund Burke famously said that society is a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to come. I say that today we are failing in that partnership. As someone who is under the age of 35, I know all too well the difficulties young people face, from enormous HECS debts to rising house prices. A Grattan report released last year shows that my generation, Gen Y, may be the first to be less wealthy than our parents, who have benefited from sustained economic growth and high levels of spending. Whether it's hard to get a job, buy your own home, or start a business, it does sometimes seem that the deck is stacked against you. We face high levels of debt, working longer, retiring later, whilst also paying in the future higher levels of tax. I noticed that while the debate around housing affordability is focused on stamp duty and first home buyer grants, there has been little discussion of the level of taxation that governments are currently levying, which reduces your ability to repay a loan or save for a deposit. As it says in the book Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young, it says millennials are expected to pay higher taxes for government programs that benefit middle-aged and older Americans, many of whom have better jobs and more assets. But I'm also aware that this debate has been had before, with the baby boomers claiming that they are the hard done by generation. They were hard done by the generation before them as well. And I have sympathy for the views of retirees who have worked their entire lives and contributed to the system and are now simply receiving their dues. Clearly, these are difficult problems to solve, or they would have been solved already. But governments need to determine how to create a sustainable demographic dividend or risk forfeiting the future altogether. The third way that governments have divorced the economic from the social is by doggedly pursuing ideologically driven social programs at huge taxpayers' expense, mainly driven by the political left. Take the issue of border protection. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion about border protection, but what they're not entitled to are their own facts. And the facts are these. After ending John Howard's successful border protection regime, based on nothing more than pure ideology, more than 50,000 people entered this country illegally on over 800 boats under Labor's term in government. The total cost blew out to over $11.5 billion and over 1,000 people died at sea. This was a completely avoidable and unnecessary waste of taxpayer money that could have gone to schools, roads or hospitals. But what is most tragic about this policy is that it resulted in an appalling loss of human life. Like much left-wing politics, this was more about feeling good rather than about actually doing good. Since the federal Liberals came to power, only one boat has reached Australia. The reduced cost of this program will save, they say, $500 million over the forward estimates. Another example of gratuitous waste is the almost religious devotion of the political left to climate change. Whatever your opinion on the causes of climate change, once again, the facts are these. Australia is responsible for about 1.5% of global carbon emissions. If we achieved a target of a 5% cut in emissions, this would reduce the world's temperature by 0.0038 of a degree by 2100. And to achieve this momentous target, Labor and the Greens managed to set up a Department of Climate Change with a $200 million budget, a $256 million clean energy regulator, a $10 billion clean energy finance corporation, a $3.2 billion Australian renewable energy agency, and a $25 million climate change authority, all staffed by hundreds of bureaucrats earning well above the national average in salaries. These are the same people now in opposition who tell us that the government needs to tax more of your super because they're running out of money. This is not an argument about the merits of climate change action. It is an argument about the cost-benefit of how much we're getting for how much we're spending. Governments of all persuasions have a tendency to trumpet record spends rather than to trumpet record outcomes. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of modern political debate is focusing and arguing on the size of the inputs rather than the outcomes achieved. It's long been a truth in business that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. But this thinking seems to be missing from politicians and public servants. Yet it can be harder to define and track metrics for government policies, especially social ones. But at the end of the day, what our citizens care about and what matters is if we have solved their problems. Here in New South Wales, we are setting up a plan where we are defining key metrics of performance that we will be measured against. Things like what percentages of our trains run on time, what is the waiting time at each hospital, how many students are enrolled in each school, and how easy it is to enrol. For state governments, collecting data is an important enabler of this approach. I believe that all ministers, whether in New South Wales or across the country, should have access to key data in real time that tracks and measures them against outcomes rather than spending. I started this in New South Wales, and in my own portfolio where we manage the new rollout of Service New South Wales, in my office we have a computer screen in real time which tracks the waiting time of every single Service New South Wales centre in New South Wales. So we see this as an important attribute where, whilst it might be harder for us, given that these metrics will be available and will be publicly judged on them, it's the best way to ensure that we are focused daily on the outcomes of the operations that we are running within government. Unfortunately, few in the media tend to connect the government's wasteful social policy with their constant need to have one hand in our pocket. The main culprit in this area is our so-called national broadcaster, the ABC. I don't know if anyone from the ABC is here, but and look, I would not be a member of my party if I did not have a comment today on the ABC. So here are my 2 cents. According to its own code, the ABC is meant to ensure the gathering and presentation of the news is impartial, reflects a diversity of views, and does not favour one perspective over another. That's their code, not mine. In practice, the ABC is simply a mouthpiece for left-of-centre views and becoming more disconnected from the values of mainstream Australia. My concern with the ABC is that it continually attacks governments of all political persuasions only from the left. All too often, you can only expect one point of view from the ABC on major issues like climate change and border protection. When is the last time you heard the ABC run lines criticising the government for being too soft on border control or not reforming our workplace relation laws? The answer is you don't. From news to current affairs on radio, TV and online, the ABC has zero tolerance for ideological diversity. This is not so much a party political bias as it is a cultural bias towards the left. The result is that the ABC distorts the national conversation around important issues by amplifying some voices and virtually ignoring the rest. This is to say nothing of the fact that it currently receives taxpayer funding to the tune of $1 billion and is crowding out private news organisations at a time when the media sector is undergoing a once-in-a-generation transformation. There's a reason why so many people in my party are angry at the ABC. And it's not only in the breach of its code of practice, it's in the breach of its social contract with mainstream Australia. The problem is not with individual Q&A episodes or issues of free speech. The problem is with the ABC itself. The Q&A episode last week only gave us an insight into the mindset that dominates at the ABC and shows and sees that show primarily as a conservative shaming exercise without even a pretense of balance. Every institution needs reform, and in the case of the ABC, that reform is long overdue. What is needed is not so much a change in budget, but as a change in culture, starting from the top down. A move from the inner city, perhaps to Western Sydney, would also serve to better remind and connect the ABC to everyday Australians. I'm encouraged by the recent statements taken by the Federal Communications Minister that finally some action will be taken. It is high time that Australia and Australians had a public broadcaster that was truly representative of our national makeup. Ladies and gentlemen, the great divorce between economic and social policy is having very real and very damaging consequences. The unique mix of social, economic and demographic factors that exist today perhaps represent the new normal, a sustained period of low growth in which only the economically fittest can survive. But these trends also give a new energy to the debate around federation. The current system of taxation and distribution simply rewards mediocrity and provides no incentives for the states to undertake challenging economic reform. Governments at all levels need to realise that pursuing welfare state policies, failing to invest in youth, and pursuing costly social programs based on nothing more their naked ideology is a path to ruin. As the unfolding events in Greece show, the Great Divorce is an extravagance which we can no longer afford. Thank you.